America, 8.5 centuries ago. An incident takes place that will send shockwaves down through the ages. A murder. A series of brutal killings. In its wake, violence sweeps the land, and a civilization crumbles. Archaeologists have now uncovered a series of astonishing clues that may just tell us who was behind these bizarre murders, and were they cannibals? The American Southwest. The year 1150 AD. Centuries before the arrival of the first Europeans, darkness comes to a land of sand and stone. Out of the shadows, across the barren plains, a band of raiders is on the move. Their target, 4 tiny villages. A group of unsuspecting farmers. The identity of the murderers remains a mystery. What really happened that night? The scene of the crime lies in what is now southwestern Colorado, near the borders of Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, on the arid slopes of Sleeping Ute Mountain. When the Ute Mountain tribe prepared to convert this land to farming in the early 1990s, federal law required an archaeological survey. The focus of the investigation was a dry floodplain called Cowboy Wash and a site designated 5MT 10,010. Sifting through the sand, the archaeologists stumbled onto something strange and remarkable. Banks Leonard and his team uncovered the remains of an ancient village that had been abandoned suddenly. Inside, they found a pit house, an ancient southwestern dwelling, and a crime scene packed with evidence.
The first, I think, indication that maybe things were unusual at this site was on the floor. We found a fragment of an adult male human cranium sitting upside down directly on the floor, and next to it was the top vertebra from the neck. And the thought that crossed my mind on seeing that was that this looks like a decapitation and not a normal burial.
The more they looked, the more they realized the full extent of the atrocity.
Later, when we excavated what's called the vent shaft of the structure, we found over 1,000 more fragments of human bone in a pile that would have been at the base of that vent shaft, as if they had been dumped into that structure from above. Very few of these bones were whole. Many of them were extremely fragmented, and some of them seemed to have been systematically broken.
The bones told the story of a savage act. For archaeologist Pat Lambert, the challenge was to sort through the fragments.
The material was nothing like I had ever seen before in terms of human remains. And so I just set about trying to identify all of the pieces, and there were over 1,000, and to try to put them back together to reconstruct the bodies.
By reconstructing bodies, she hoped to reconstruct events, to find clues to what happened that night, the cause of all the carnage. The first clue, precise cut marks on the bones near the joints and tendons.
Cut marks occur on bone when you're taking the body apart. There's tissue that binds the joints, so you try to cut between them so that you can take the body parts apart, especially on the upper thigh bone, where people were pretty clearly trying to take the upper leg out of the thigh socket.
The cut marks proved this was not the work of animal scavengers, but humans wielding stone tools, smashing limbs and removing flesh. Lambert concluded that all this happened right around the time of death.
And so what I was seeing in these bones was the kind of fractures that you see in fresh bone, the spiral fracture, smooth margin. If you looked up towards the ends of the tubular long bones, they were sometimes peeled like a twig peels, like the bark on a twig peels. And that only happens when bone is really fresh.
These killers worked fast, and they worked with a purpose.
The bodies have been disarticulated, they've been cut apart at the joints, and the individual skeletal elements have been further broken down, maybe to break the body down, maybe to get into the marrow chamber. In some cases, there's burning on the bones, discoloration, browning or blackening from exposure to flames.
How could Lambert explain this bizarre set of clues? The pattern of burns, the cut marks, the breaks in the long bones. These were the exact same telltale signs often found on animals that had been butchered and eaten. The evidence seemed to point to just one conclusion: a raid, a series of murders, 24 victims in all. And then, cannibalism, humans killed, cut up, and consumed. It was an act as horrifying then as it is today. A shocking conclusion for even the most skeptical scientist.
It's the suite of characteristics together that suggest that this was a likely outcome. But one piece of evidence that stands out in my mind, I recall seeing it, and I remember thinking at that point, wow, this really is probably cannibalism. I don't know how else I would explain it.
That evidence lay in a second pit house, several meters to the east, the site of another grisly scene. For Lambert, it was the remains of a 14-year-old there that showed the brutal truth about the raid. The head had been split in two. The face was intact, but the back of the head was severely blackened from burning over a fire.
It's clear from the burning pattern that the head was placed on the fire whole, with the back of the head down, the flames licked up around the side, onto the forehead. But we found this head in two separate pieces. We found the back of the head in one pile and the front of the head and face in another pile. So people take the head, they put it on the fire when the brain is in it, they take it off of the fire, and they take it apart. Why would they do that?
Lambert's answer? To cook the brain. A clear case of cannibalism. But some critics disagree. They say the truth about places like Cowboy Wash is as fragmented as the bones themselves. And the evidence, no matter how compelling, is only circumstantial.
I think the problem with the cannibalism hypothesis is that it narrows our field of interpretation, our level of interpretation. There are so many other things that could create that type of signature, if you will, on those bones. It could be a secondary burial process. It could be trophy taking. It could be witchcraft persecution.
Ventura Perez, for one, believes that findings of cannibalism have been made too freely. The practice has been documented in cultures around the world, in situations ranging from burial rites to warfare and survival. But critics say cannibalism has also been a destructive label, used by colonists to brand native people savages, then enslave them or seize their land. If the issue is especially controversial in the Southwest, it's because it has opened old wounds inflicted by centuries of conflict between Native Americans and European settlers.
The wrong has been taking the remains out of the ground, studying them, researching them, exploiting our human remains. If we had our way, we would just say no to any archaeology. And there would be no story to tell. The story would be within the community.
You can look through any of the 30 existing Pueblo tribes, and cannibalism simply isn't part of their tradition, not for any of them. It's, in fact, just the opposite. Cannibalism is the ultimate expression of evil.
Here in the Four Corners region, the charges and countercharges ring like echoes off the stone walls of these desolate canyons. But the debate goes far beyond Cowboy Wash. For signs of cannibalism have turned up at dozens of southwestern sites, dating back to the 1890s. Archaeologists have concluded that the evidence is solid at more than 30 of these sites, including Cowboy Wash. Today, the site of those villages, the site of the slaughter, lies beneath stalks of corn and alfalfa. Terry Knight supervised the excavation for the Ute Mountain tribe. He has tried to understand why one person would ever eat another, even in times of warfare or extreme scarcity.
As we know through history that not everybody thinks the same, and we don't have the same ideals and everything, and so therefore a situation like that, one has to live and the other has to die. But to go a further step and consume someone, to me, that's totally, unimaginable. I just can't imagine that.
Who could commit such an unimaginable crime, and why? Was it the act of a crazed loner? An unprecedented outbreak of mob violence? Or was it a systematic practice? The answer to this mystery must lie in the identities of the people themselves, the victims and their murderers. On the hunt for the killers, investigators would have to dig deeper into a distant time and place, following a trail that has long since grown cold. Anthropologist Jonathan Haas has been wandering these corners of Arizona and New Mexico. He has visited the sites of countless villages around the time of Cowboy Wash to understand how Native Americans lived and how they died.
The fact that you've got a whole person interred here, this is the normal burial ritual that's being carried on by these people to take care of their ancestors who have passed on. Real characteristic of what you get outside the context of cannibalism, outside the context of warfare.
As an expert in ancient warfare, Haas wants to know, was the violence at Cowboy Wash part of some larger battle, an ongoing series of attacks and raids?
If you look at someplace like Cowboy Wash isn't defensively located. That they're not really worried about surprise and attack from the outside. And one of the big things that's going on with the sort of violence that you see there is that it's internal violence. It's some kind of internal social control mechanism. It's some portion of that society that is inducing another portion of that society to do something they wouldn't otherwise do.
Internal violence. That means the killers might have known their victims. Not soldiers in battle, but neighbor attacking and even eating neighbor. Perhaps it was starvation that drove them to act. Yet tens of thousands had learned to live in these arid lands, surviving even when crops failed. So Haas and his colleagues began to rule out hunger. Instead, the search for answers would take them into different territory, into realms strange and haunting, into the dark logic of this savage raid. The truth would begin to emerge in clues that would cast the entire mystery of Cowboy Wash in a brand new light. A raid in the night, a series of murders. As archaeologists reconstructed the events at Cowboy Wash, the evidence led them to some intriguing conclusions. First, there was more than just one killer.
It seems like it must have been quite a few people, because there's 7 people here who were butchered up, and presumably, at least to some extent, they were cannibalized. It seems as though the larger community was attacked around the same time. This implies some kind of scale, not just a couple of individuals. It seems like it was involving more than a few individuals.
Second, this was no hit-and-run raid. The killers worked in an organized, even methodical fashion.
A lot of that came from Pat Lambert's analysis of breakage patterns and the evidence for the methods of butchering. But you could also see that in the second pit structure, in the way bones were sometimes left in stacks. For example, here's a stack of arm and leg parts, and here's a stack of just arm parts.
Third, this was no simple robbery murder. The killers left behind many valuable items, such as pottery and jewelry.
They left behind things of value, and people's remains were left scattered on the floors. Things were left behind that normally wouldn't be left behind at a site. There was no attempt to clean up or rearrange things, and there was also no obvious evidence that this had been a ritualistic act.
Clearly, there was a much deeper story here at Cowboy Wash. Hints of larger forces in action. Jonathan Haas is retracing the footsteps of these ancient Americans. His goal? To explain the violence that happened, not just at Cowboy Wash, but eventually throughout the entire region. The turmoil that would spread beyond 1 or 2 villages to engulf the American Southwest. To him, the murders at Cowboy Wash were driven by the darker motives of politics and power.
If something really bad happens to you, and what happened at Cowboy Wash was really bad. It was horrifying what happened at Cowboy Wash. I mean, you really have people being killed and slaughtered in the way animals are being slaughtered, and apparently eaten. And that serves as a pretty powerful inducement for getting people to go along with whatever it is those other folks want you to go along with.
To find these killers, Haas and other archaeologists have set out on a strange and enigmatic journey. The trail has led them to the story of a lost civilization. A mysterious people that rose up from the sandy ravines of the Southwest. The year, 900 AD. The Anasazi, the ancient Pueblans, began to create an advanced civilization centered in Chaco Canyon in today's New Mexico. Chaco's influence extended to settlements 500 miles out across the desert. Cowboy Wash lay on the edge of that system. In Chaco itself, palaces were constructed, and enormous spiritual meeting places called kivas. Here was architecture on a scale never before seen in North America. Archaeologist John Kantner has spent most of his professional life climbing among the ruins of Chaco Canyon. For him, the answer to the riddle of southwestern cannibalism can be found in the Chaco system itself, in its connection to the supernatural world.
What people wanted out of Chaco Canyon was some way to ensure that rainfall came, to ensure that their crops would actually survive through the year and be fruitful. People would come here and they would be hoping that their crops would be successful.
Chaco's leaders aligned their buildings to track the movement of the stars and the sun, and the changing seasons. They offered their followers clues when to plant, when to harvest. Small wonder that today, Chaco has become an inspiration for New Age students looking for a society that lived in harmony with the land.
It took a while for archaeologists and anthropologists and the general public, the larger public, to understand that the Southwest wasn't always a happy, peaceful place where everybody lived in harmony with their environment.
From the first excavations at Chaco, there was evidence of a darker side. In 1897, a stack of mutilated bodies turned up in a room within Pueblo Bonito, the largest of Chaco's great houses. One early archaeologist concluded that the inhabitants had occasionally resorted to the eating of human flesh.
This peaceful era that coincides with Chaco Canyon, the peace that Chaco enforced perhaps, was broken and punctuated by acts of really savage violence, of brutal violence. There are not many of them, but there's 20 or 30 of these incidents that are known from archaeological research, where a whole family or an extended family, a whole bunch of people, men, women, grandma, grandpa, little kids, are all killed.
In the 12th century, the violence began to escalate. Something changed, and the center could no longer hold. Some believe it was a shift in the weather, a severe drought that began in 1145 and lasted 50 years. Then, perhaps, the first stirrings of dissent. According to one theory, the killers hailed from great houses linked to the Chacoan system, all part of a desperate campaign to hold on to their wealth and power. John Kantner has seen the evidence of blood spilled across these sands.
I think what's happening during this time period is that the leaders of Chaco are beginning to feel that things are just not going quite their way. There may be a sense of paranoia, perhaps a sense of desperation, that as they see that the climate is not quite as good as it was, they're trying to perhaps overextend themselves beyond what their religious authority allows. And so I think this is really a change in Chaco from a more benign religious authority to a much more coercive, violent authority.
Kantner believes they sent out enforcers, thugs dispatched to terrify anyone who had strayed from the fold, to set an example, to send a message.
You can imagine that if you want to try to make a real statement, certainly just killing someone is going to be a statement in and of itself. But if you actually go and mutilate their bodies, perhaps even eat portions of them, then you are asserting a level of dominance of that individual that you're mutilating and perhaps eating that is far beyond just killing them. I think people are making a statement. These people were at Cowboy Wash, they were doing something bad. So we're going to completely obliterate them. This is what will happen to you if you also begin to try to resist what we're trying to do up north in the San Juan area.
It was a message delivered with terrifying efficiency, a message that would be heard all across the Southwest. Repression, terrorism. As it turns out, the murders at Cowboy Wash were only the last in a series of attacks, a pattern of violence against the villagers there.
Even at 5MT 10,010, there were a couple of people who had healed club injuries. And one of them was the 14-year-old whose head was burned and whose body had been cut apart and put on the fire. So even before that happened, something was going on, severe enough to sustain an injury to the forehead and another one to the back of the head. There was another man buried out in the midden of that same site who had presumably died before this final attack on the village. He also had a clubbing type of injury to his forehead that had healed. So this tells us that something was going on, that 10,010 wasn't entirely isolated in terms of aggressive interactions.
There was one more clue that seemed to explain this climate of violence. A piece of evidence that just didn't fit, and it pointed to yet another theory. Some of the pottery left behind in those abandoned pit houses originated in the Chuscan mountain range, more than 50 miles away. That kind of ceramic would rarely be found in this area, unless the villagers at Cowboy Wash had brought it themselves. Could these villagers have been immigrants from another region? Could they have been singled out as being different? In this time, in this corner of the Southwest, anyone seen as different could be marked for a terrible fate. They were labeled witches and accused of bringing evil to the community, causing drought, illness, famine, through secret rites and supernatural powers. They would be dealt with swiftly and harshly. Some killings in the ancient Southwest may well bear the distinct methodology of witch executions. Andrew Darling excavated a series of hacked-up bodies at a site just north of Cowboy Wash known as Yellow Jacket.
What I found in my research was that Pueblo people execute witches in very specific ways ceremonially, and witch execution includes the defleshing, cutting up, and burning of human bodies felt to be the bodies of witches. And this is the way you destroy a witch, because to kill a witch, you have to not only kill the soul of the witch, but you have to destroy the body of the witch as well. So the long, protracted process of killing a witch is what I feel we were seeing on the floors of kivas and pit houses.
Archaeologist Ventura Perez believes that while cannibalism may have occurred in a few rare cases, it doesn't explain most of the findings. Instead, he sees a ritual process. People accused, killed, then ceremonially chopped up.
If you're trying to destroy that witch, the first thing you're going to have to do is disarticulate the witch, cut the witch up, and you're going to section that witch off. And you're going to go for the joints and cut at the joints, and then beyond that, breaking up of the long bones, smashing them. All of this produces a very similar signature to that of what's implied for cannibalism.
Perez believes that if he can discover the murder weapons, he can discern the killer's motives. Ancient craftsmen used flint to make a variety of knives, for use in rituals with ornate designs and fragile edges, for butchering animals with sharp, sturdy blades.
Cut marks can tell you the type of tool that was being used depending on what that cut mark looks like under the microscope. it could possibly be a bifacially worked tool, something that could have religious or ideological significance. If the cut mark is smoothed, the kerf walls are smooth, it could be produced with a utilitarian tool, something that doesn't necessarily have any religious significance, but is just designed to be an expedient cutting tool.
Tracking these blades in several cases in the Southwest, Perez measures and sketches cut marks found on ancient bones. Then he puts on a synthetic polymer to make a cast. As he peels it off, a perfect duplicate emerges. Perez cuts the model on a circular saw and creates a thin section, a tiny slice he can analyze under the microscope.
Here we have a cut mark on a human bone, and this bone has a signature that would be produced by a serrated or bifacially worked blade. This type of blade is used more for ceremony than for practical or utilitarian purposes. They're very difficult to make, they're very time-consuming, and they do a lousy job cutting. Here we have a cross-section of a deer, and we know that this animal was butchered to be consumed. The difference here is striking. There's no serrated edge. It's very clean, it's very sharp. It's like it was made with a butcher's knife or a scalpel. This is the way you process meat.
For Perez, the evidence across the Southwest points to ceremonial killings, but not necessarily cannibalism. Flesh chopped like meat, but not consumed.
Cowboy Wash could have been a case where a number of individuals using a particular kiva or pit house were identified as members of the witch society. It may only be one person that then is interrogated and is asked to confess whose souls have you stolen and who else is a member of your religious society. And that person, under duress, may then begin to identify a number of other individuals. And then in order to remove this ill health in the community, to bring stability back, it may escalate and become an actual full-scale, multiple execution.
Was it witchcraft execution, or cannibalism, or both? Here in the rolling canyonlands, the truth seems as elusive as the rains. Scattered facts, blowing like tumbleweeds across this hard and jagged land. But at Cowboy Wash, there was one more key piece of evidence. A kind of clue that had never been found at any of the southwestern cannibalism sites. It was a coprolite, a fossilized human feces left right in the hearth of one of the pit houses. Biochemist Richard Marler of the University of Colorado had been experimenting with techniques to find traces of animal blood on ancient arrowheads. He analyzed the Cowboy Wash coprolite to see if it contained evidence that backed up or disproved the finding of cannibalism.
The issue of cannibalism was controversial, since there's many other theories that could explain the archaeological and bone evidence. But there was no direct evidence that the food was actually brought up to the lips and consumed. So that controversy has remained.
With the discovery of the coprolite, an entire new avenue of research opened up. Marler's goal, to find a telltale indicator, proof that the flesh of one human had passed through the digestive system of another.
We were able to find a protein that is not found in the intestines, where the fecal material would be moving through, but is present in striated muscle, or the muscle tissues of the legs and the arms. And that protein is myoglobin.
Myoglobin delivers oxygen to muscles and heart tissue. Marler and his team designed a series of tests to search for the distinctive human version of this protein.
The first thing we had to do was to make sure the method that we used only recognized human myoglobin. It did not recognize any other species present in the area, such as deer or antelope, rabbit, or anything else.
Then they used a procedure taken right out of modern crime labs. They ground up the material, then added an antibody, a special molecule that recognizes only human myoglobin. Yellow would be negative, no myoglobin. Blue would indicate that myoglobin was present. And blue turned up again and again.
Myoglobin is normally never present in the fecal material. The only way it could be present in the fecal material is if somebody consumed it.
To many archaeologists, this was definitive proof, the smoking gun. And Marler's study yielded still more evidence. Myoglobin on cooking pots found in one of the pit houses, and in the coprolite found in the hearth. Another telltale chemical that seemed to confirm the fate of the 14-year-old whose skull was charred over an open fire.
We were able to identify a brain-specific protein, a protein that was only found in the brain or in the spinal column, and never in the circulation and never in the fecal material. This protein, specific to human, was found in this coprolite. So not only did they consume muscle tissue, they also consumed brain tissue.
I think it's important that it be retested from an outside lab. And even if it does come back as true, what we can say is that at one point in time, providing that we're 100% convinced that this is human, at one point in time, one individual ate another individual and then defecated in the hearth. The mere fact that the fecal matter is found in the hearth in the kiva is yet, I would argue, another form of symbolic violence, and is far more interesting to me than whether or not somebody ate somebody.
Cannibalism or not, what is certain is that the brutal acts at Cowboy Wash foreshadowed the coming of dark times. For the killers had little idea of the forces they would unleash. In the decades that followed the massacre at Cowboy Wash, the Southwest began to undergo convulsive change. Half of the documented cases of cannibalism came within the next 25 years. It wasn't long until the Chaco system entered its death throes. Its great houses were now abandoned. Ironically, all signs of cannibalism soon disappeared, but out-and-out violence rose dramatically.
When Chaco goes away, real warfare erupts, between villages. That central authority is gone, and the way they resolve their differences, and they have many at that point, is villages will whack villages, and coalitions of villages will gang up on another village, and you see whole towns that are burned.
Warfare, ritual killings, raids. Death stalked these sands in many guises. Jonathan Haas has been tracking the demise of southwestern society in Chaco's wake.
This environment is a marginal environment in the best of times. There's never a lot of rain. And at about 1150 AD, you begin to see a shift in the environment. And the environment goes from one that is favorable to farming, particularly rainfall farming, to one that's not favorable to farming. So at around 1150, you move into a down cycle. And what's happening is that I'm getting malnutrition in the population. Children are dying. You get infant mortality. And so you and 8 other families get together, all the men in that family, and they raid that house to steal all their corn. And in the course of stealing their corn, Grandma gets killed. Because Grandma doesn't, Grandma's not going to let you steal the corn. And she can't run away, and Grandma gets killed. And you get corn, but you also get an enemy. And you then get into a wave of violence. So it starts small, but it builds over time. And you've got to move to someplace like this because the warfare very rapidly becomes endemic. And the entire region is undergoing conflict. By around 1250, you see warfare across the entire northern Southwest. It sweeps in like flames.
Living in constant fear of attack, whole villages went looking for safe housing. Quite literally, they took to the hills, the craggy peaks of the Four Corners region. Recently, Haas discovered a network of defensive sites, 100 miles from Cowboy Wash in Arizona. A chain of fortifications looking out across the valleys.
The primary thing that this site fulfills is that it's almost impossible to get to. And the only reason you can have for making your home so inaccessible is defense. Is that what you're worried about is you're worried about attack from the outside.
Not far away, to the east of Sleeping Ute Mountain, the Anasazi would take to sites set directly into the stone. The remarkable cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. Built on the canyon walls, carved into steep, sheer rock faces, these precarious perches were accessible only by narrow passageways. Here, people could live sealed off from the world, guarding their corn and their families. These dwellings were masterpieces of ancient engineering, houses of fear, born of terror. But as the terror of the times increased, many villagers weren't safe, even up in their fortified dwellings. Castle Rock was encircled by a series of protective walls. When archaeologists dug into the rubble at its base, they found evidence of a massacre. Over 40 people killed, their bodies piled into a kiva. Threats like this led other Anasazi communities to take ever more extreme defensive measures.
We're now at the base of the rock, the primary rock that the site sits on. And there's an 80-room pueblo sitting on top of that rock. We're, 500 feet in altitude, as well as almost half a kilometer from their primary source of water, and their fields and their crops and everything else are even further than that. These are people who are terribly worried about their safety and their well-being, the safety of not only their food, but also their families, in order to move to someplace like this.
Day in and day out, the residents carried their water and food, climbing along precarious toeholds and rocky trails. In Arizona, the mountaintop residences discovered by Haas were lined up across the mesas like great strings of watchtowers, each guarding its neighbors against surprise attack or an invasion from across the plains. For a time, they were safe. But finally, this way of life couldn't last. Violence and fear would take such a toll that an entire society would come crashing down. For the people of the Four Corners region, holed up in their fortifications, the clock was ticking, and it didn't have long to run.
At the end of 20 years, you're starting to use up the soils in the land that you farm. But where do you move to? The strategic locations are all taken. So you can't move and you stay put. And 1275 comes. You still can't move, and the land's even worse than it was before because you've used it for 5 more years. And what happens is one of these communities gives up. One of these communities can no longer survive, and they leave the area. But what happens when they leave the area is that all the sites that are dependent upon them for that intervisibility network, the system collapses. And so it just takes 1 or 2 communities moving out after 35 years of living in one spot. 1 or 2 communities move out and the whole system collapses. And it's at that point that the Four Corners is abandoned. By 1286, 1290, there's nobody left here. Everybody's gone. And the only reason you explain everybody being gone is with systemic collapse.
And so the terrible chain of events that began in places like Cowboy Wash rolled on to their fateful end. The collapse of the Chaco Empire, the abandonment of the region.
One of the research questions that we're still pursuing after all these years is the abandonment of the Four Corners, when tens of thousands of people leave between 1275 and 1300. And this is really unusual in human history, to have that many people leave altogether. Somebody decides this place is no longer working for us. Bad things are happening here. It's time to go. And this is the story that comes up again and again in Pueblo histories, is that portents, signs, events say, yeah, you know, it's time to leave. The middle place has shifted. We need to be out of here and find it somewhere else.
Back at Cowboy Wash, Terry Knight has reburied all the bones, laying to rest those who came before him to this dry and desolate land. As spiritual leader of his tribe, his job was to pay final respects to a people who were accorded no respect at the end of their lives. The poor farmers at Cowboy Wash. New excavations may one day shed light on their fate and the dark motives that drove the killers. Were they thugs on a witch hunt? Were they political terrorists? And why cannibalism? We may never know, for this barren land guards its secrets well.
What happened at 5MT 10,010? What happened in the Cowboy Aztec Wash community? What happened in the Mesa Verde area? What was happening in the world at this time? We build these different levels of history, and all together they add up to a larger picture of what we are and what our past is.
There is an old Navajo story that tells of evil that swept these Chaco lands. Something terrible happened here that threw the world out of balance. And perhaps it is true, for the terror at Cowboy Wash did prefigure the end of a civilization. Today, all that remains are scattered clues in the ancient buildings and the rocky soil. A tale of violence cut deep into the bone.